Semitic-speaking peoples refers to the peoples who spoke Semitic languages. Ethno-linguistically, they are usually divided into three branches: East, Central and South Semitic. Proto-Semitic was likely spoken in the 4th millennium BC, and the oldest attested forms of Semitic date to the mid-3rd millennium. Speakers of East Semitic include the Akkadians and the descended cultures of Assyria and Babylonia. Central Semitic combines Northwest Semitic and Arabic. Speakers of Northwest Semitic were the Canaanites and the Arameans. South Semitic peoples include the speakers of South Arabian and Ethiopic origins. The region of origin of the reconstructed Proto-Semitic language, ancestral to historical and modern Semitic languages in the Middle East, is still uncertain and much debated. A 2009 Bayesian analysis identified an origin for Semitic languages in the Levant around 3750 BC, with the later single introduction of Geez from what is now South Arabia into the Horn of Africa around 800 BC, with a slightly earlier introduction into parts of North Africa and southern Spain with the founding of Phoenician colonies such as ancient Carthage in the 9th century BC and Cadiz in the 10th century BC. The earliest records of Semitic languages are from 30th century BCE Mesopotamia. Other theories include origins in the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa. Between the 30th and 20th centuries BC, Semitic languages covered a broad area which encompassed what are today the modern states and regions of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, the Sinai Peninsula, Malta and northwest Iran. The earliest written evidence of them are found in the Fertile Crescent Sea, the 30th century BC, an area encompassing Sumer, the Akkadian Empire and others civilizations of Assyria and Babylonia along the Tigris and Euphrates, followed by historical written evidence from the Levant, Canaan, Sinai Peninsula, southern and eastern Anatolia and the Arabian Peninsula. The Semitic family is a member of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, all of whose other 5 or more branches have their origin in North Africa or the Maghreb. Largely for this reason, the ancestors of Proto-Semitic speakers were originally believed by some to have first arrived in the Middle East from North Africa, possibly as part of the operation of the Saharan pump around the late Neolithic. Diakonov's East Semitic originating between the Nile Delta and Canaan as the northernmost branch of Afro-Asiatic. Lynch even wonders whether the highly divergent Gurage languages indicate an origin in Ethiopia. Identification of the hypothetical Proto-Semitic region of origin is therefore dependent on the larger geographic distributions of the other language families within Afro-Asiatic, whose origins are also hotly debated. According to Christy G. Turner too, there is an archaeological and physical anthropological reason for a relation between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and the Nachafian culture. In one interpretation, Proto-Semitic itself is assumed to have reached the Arabian Peninsula by approximately the 4th millennium BC, from which Semitic daughter languages continued to spread outwards. When written records began in the late 4th millennium BC, the Semitic-speaking Akkadians were entering Mesopotamia from the deserts to the west, and were probably already present in places such as Ebla in Syria. Akkadian personal names began appearing in written record in Mesopotamia from the late 29th century BC. The earliest positively proven historical attestation of any Semitic people comes from 30th century BC Mesopotamia, with the East Semitic-speaking peoples of the Kish civilization entering the region originally dominated by the people of Sumer. The earliest known Akkadian inscription was found on a boleta, addressed to the very early pre-Sargonic king Meskang Nunna of Ur by his queen Gansaman, who is thought to have been from Akkad. However, Some of the names appearing on the Sumerian king list as prehistoric rulers of Kish have been held to indicate his Semitic presence even before this, as early as the 30th or 29th century BC. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, many states and cities in Mesopotamia had come to be ruled or dominated by Akkadian-speaking Semites, including Assyria, Esnunna, the Akkadian Empire, Kish, Bulzan, Uruk, Adab, Nippur, Ekalatum, Nuzi, Akshak, Eridu and Lhasa. During this period, another East Semitic-speaking people, the Eblites, appear in the historical record from northern Syria. They founded the state of Ebla, whose Eblate language was closely related to the Akkadian of Mesopotamia. The Akkadians, Assyrians and Eblites were the first Semitic-speaking people to use writing, using the cuneiform script originally developed by the Sumerians c. 3500 BC, with the first writings in Akkadian dating from c. 2800 BC. The last Akkadian inscriptions date from the late 1st century AD, and cuneiform script in the 2nd century AD, both in Mesopotamia, 2nd millennium BC. By the late 3rd millennium BC, East Semitic languages such as Akkadian and Eblate were dominant in Mesopotamia and northeast Syria, while West Semitic languages such as Amorite, Canaanite and Ugaritic were probably spoken from Syria to the Arabian Peninsula. Although Old South Arabian is considered by most people to be South Semitic language despite the sparsity of data, the Akkadian language of Akkad, Assyria and Babylonia had become the dominant literary language of the Fertile Crescent, using the cuneiform script that was adapted from the Sumerians. The Old Assyrian Empire, Babylonian Empire and in particular the Middle Assyrian Empire, facilitated the use of Akkadian as a lingua franca in many regions outside its homeland. The related, but more sparsely attested, Eblate disappeared with the city, and Amorite is attested only from proper names in Mesopotamian records. For the 2nd millennium, somewhat more data are available, thanks to the Egyptian hieroglyphics-derived Proto-Sinaitic alphabet. Proto-Canaanite texts from around 1500 BC yield the first undisputed attestations of a West Semitic language, followed by the much more extensive Ugaritic tablets of northern Syria from around 1300 BC. Incursions of nomadic Semitic Aramaeans and Sutians begin around this time, followed by Chaldans in the late 10th century BC. Akkadian continued to flourish, splitting into Babylonian and Assyrian dialects of the West Semitic-speaking peoples who occupied what is today Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian territories and the Sinai Peninsula. The earliest references concern the Canaanite-speaking Amorites of northern and eastern Syria, and date from the 24th century BC in Mesopotamian annals. The technologically advanced Sumerians, Akkadians and Assyrians of Mesopotamia mentioned the West Semitic-speaking peoples in disparaging terms. The Ma-tu who know no grain. The Ma-tu who know no house nor town. The boors of the mountains. The Ma-tu who digs up truffles, who does not bend his knees, who eats raw meat, who has no house during his lifetime, who is not buried after death. Quote, however, after initially being prevented from doing so by powerful Assyrian kings of the Old Assyrian Empire intervening from northern Mesopotamia, these Amorites would eventually overrun southern Mesopotamia and found the state of Babylon in 1894 BC, where they became Akkadianized, adopted Mesopotamian culture and language, and blended into the indigenous population. Babylon became the center of a short-lived but influential Babylonian Empire in the 18th century BC, and subsequent to this southern Mesopotamia came to be known as Babylonia, with Babylon superseding the far more ancient city of Nippur as the primary religious center of southern Mesopotamia. Northern Mesopotamia had long before already coalesced into Assyria. After the fall of the First Babylonian Empire, the far south of Mesopotamia broke away for about 300 years, becoming the independent Akkadian-speaking Sealand dynasty. Proto-Canaanite texts from northern Canaan and the Levant around 1500 BC yield the first undisputed attestations of the written West Semitic language, followed by the much more extensive Ugaritic tablets of northern Syria from the late 14th century BC in the city-state of Ugarit in northwest Syria. Ugaritic was a West Semitic language, fairly closely related to, and part of the same general language family as the tongues of the Amorites, Canaanites, Phoenicians, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, Amalekites and Israelites. The appearance of nomadic Semitic-speaking Alamu, Aramaeans and Scythians in historical record also dates from the late 14th century BC, the Aramaeans coming to dominate an area roughly corresponding with modern Syria, subsuming the earlier Amorites, and founding states such as Aram, Damascus, Luhuti, Bitagusi, Hamath, Aram Napharaim, Paddan Aram, Aram Rehob, Idlib and Zobah, while the Scythians occupied the deserts of southeastern Syria and northeastern Jordan. Between the 13th and 11th centuries BC, a number of small Canaanite-speaking states arose in southern Canaan, an area approximately corresponding to modern Israel, Jordan, the Palestinian territories and Sinai Peninsula. These were the lands of the Edomites, Moabites, Hebrews, Ammonites and Amalekites, all of whom spoke closely related West Semitic Canaanite languages. The Philistines are conjectured to have been one of the sea peoples who seem to have arrived in southern Canaan sometime in the 12th century. In this theory, the Philistines would have spoken an Indo-European language, as there are possibly Greek, Lydian and Luwian traces in the limited information available about the tongue, although there is no detailed information about the language. An Indo-European Anatolian origin is also supported by Philistine pottery, which appears to have been exactly the same as Mycenaean Greek pottery. In the 19th century BC, a similar wave of Canaanite-speaking Semites entered Egypt, and by the early 17th century BC these Canaanites had conquered the country, forming the 15th dynasty, introducing military technology new to Egypt, such as the war chariot. In ancient Egypt, the natives were speakers of a non-Semitic but related Afroasiatic tongue, the Egyptian language. Other early Afroasiatic-speaking populations dwelled nearby in the Maghreb, the ancient Libyans of the northern Sahara and the coasts of northwest Africa, as well as to the southeast in the land of Punt and in northern Sudan, which was previously inhabited by the A group, C group and Kerma cultures. First millennium BC. In the first millennium BC, the alphabet spread much further, giving us a picture not just of Canaanite but also of Aramaic, Old South Arabian, and early Geez. During this period, the case system, once vigorous in Ugaritic, seems to have started decaying in Northwest Semitic. Phoenician colonies spread the Canaanite language throughout much of the Mediterranean, while its close relative, Hebrew, became the vehicle of a religious literature, the Torah and Tanakh, which would have global ramifications. However, as an ironic result of the Assyrian Empire's vast conquests, Aramaic became the lingua franca of the Fertile Crescent and much of the Near East and parts of Anatolia, gradually pushing Akkadian, Hebrew, Phoenician, Canaanite, and several other languages to extinction, although Hebrew and Akkadian remained in use as sacred languages, Hebrew in particular developing a substantial literature. Ethiopian Semitic languages are first attested by the 9th century BC, with the earliest Proto-Gez inscriptions of the Kingdom of Demant using the South Arabian alphabet. During the Middle Assyrian Empire and in particular the Neo-Assyrian Empire, much of the Near East, Asia Minor, Caucasus, Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, ancient Iran and North Africa fell under Assyrian domination. During the 8th century BC, the Assyrian Emperor Tiglath-Pileser III introduced Aramaic as the lingua franca of their empire, and this language was to remain dominant among Near Eastern Semites until the early Middle Ages, and is still in use as the mother tongue of the modern Assyrians and Mandaeans to the present day. In addition, the Syriac language and Syriac script emerged in Achaemenid Assyria during the 5th century BC, and this dialect of Eastern Aramaic was to have a major influence on the spread of Christianity and Gnosticism throughout the Near East from the 1st century AD onwards. A Canaanite group known as the Phoenicians came to dominate the coasts of Syria, Lebanon and southwest Turkey from the 13th century BC, founding city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Samarra, Arwad, Berytus, Antioch and Aradus, eventually spreading their influence throughout the Mediterranean, including building colonies in Malta, Sicily, the Iberian Peninsula and the coasts of North Africa, founding the major city-state of Carthage in the 9th century BC. The Phoenicians created the Phoenician alphabet in the 12th century BC, which would eventually supersede cuneiform. The first mentions of Chaldeans and Arabs appear in Assyrian records of the mid-9th century BC. Phoenician became one of the most widely used writing systems, spread by Phoenician merchants across the Mediterranean world and beyond, where it evolved and was assimilated by many other cultures. The still extant Aramaic alphabet, a modified form of Phoenician script, was the ancestor of modern Hebrew's Syriac, Assyrian and Arab scripts, stylistic variants and descendants of the Aramaic script. The Greek alphabet was a direct successor of Phoenician, though certain letter values were changed to represent vowels. Old Italic, Anatolian, Armenian, Georgian and Paleo-Hispanic scripts are also descendant of Phoenician script. A number of pre-Arab and non-Arab Semitic-speaking states are mentioned as existing in what was much later to become known as the Arabian Peninsula, in Akkadian and Assyrian records as colonies of these Mesopotamian powers, such as Meluhha and Dilmun. A number of other South Semitic states existed in the far south of the peninsula, such as Sheba, Saba, Magan and Uba, although the histories of these states is sketchy, as there was no written script in the region at this time. Later still, written evidence of Old South Arabian and Ge'ez offer the first written attestations of South Semitic languages in the 8th century BC in Sheba, Uba and Magan. These idioms, along with the Ge'ez script, were later imported to Ethiopia and Eritrea by migrating South Semites from South Arabia during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Subsequent interaction with other Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations, Cushitic speakers who had settled in the area some centuries prior, gave rise to the present-day Ethiopian Semitic languages. After the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the succeeding short-lived Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Semitic-speaking peoples lost control of the Near East to the Persian Achaemenid Empire. However, the Persians had spent centuries under Assyrian domination and influence, and despite being Indo-European speakers, they retained the imperial Aramaic of the Assyrian Empire as the lingua franca of their own empire, and many of the Semitic nations of the region continued to exist as geopolitical entities, albeit as occupied satrapies of the Achaemenid Empire. In the satrapy of Assyria, the Syriac language emerged during the 5th century BC. The dominant position of Aramaic as the language of empire ended with the Greek Macedonian Empire and its succeeding Seleucid Empire. After Alexander the Great conquered the Achaemenid Empire, his successors introduced Greek as the official language. However, this did not impact on the spoken tongues of the Semitic peoples, who continued to be largely Aramaic-speaking. Both the Akkadian of the Assyrian and Babylonian Mesopotamians, and the Canaanite languages of the Israelites, Judeans, Samaritans, Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites and Phoenicians decreased steadily in the face of the adoption of Aramaic from the 8th century BC onwards, and by the early first millennium CE they had largely disappeared. Although distinct forms of Hebrew remained in continuous literary and religious use among Jews and Samaritans, isolated use of Akkadian remained in Assyria and Babylonia between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD, and the Punic dialect of Phoenician remained in use in the Carthaginian-ruled parts of the Mediterranean until the 3rd century AD. Later history. Aramaic, in the form of Syriac, was the lingua franca of Ashuristan and the Neo-Assyrian states of Adiabene, Ashur, Osrane, Beth-Nuhadra, Beth-Gama and Hatra, extant between the 2nd century BC and 3rd century AD, and was to become the vehicle for the spread of Syriac Christianity throughout the entire Near East. Aramaic was also the language of the Aramaean state of Palmyra and the short-lived Palmyrene Empire. Aramaic dialects continued to be dominant among the peoples of what are today Iraq, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestinian territories, Kuwait, Sinai, southeastern Turkey, and parts of northwestern Iran and some areas the northern Arabian Peninsula, until the Arab-Islamic conquest of the 7th century AD. After this, Arabic gradually replaced Aramaic as a part of a steady process of Arabization and Islamification, accompanied by the influx of a large number of Muslim Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula. Although the Syriac language, script and literature continued to exert influence upon Arabic into the Middle Ages, nevertheless, a number of Eastern Aramaic dialects survive as the spoken tongues of the Assyrians of northern Iraq, southeast Turkey, northeast Syria and northwest Iran, and of the Mandaeans of Iraq and Iran, with somewhere between 575,000 and 1 million fluent speakers in total. The Western Aramaic of the Aramaeans themselves is now almost extinct, with only a few thousand speakers extant in and around Malula in western Syria. Hebrew survived as the liturgical language of Judaism, and it was revived in the 19th century, in the form of Ivrit, the spoken tongue of modern Israel.